"Your kindness is precious," whispered Walter Dempsey, a white outcast, to Talia Monroe, a young black woman breaking his silence in Fairhaven's quiet chapel. Each dawn, Talia left food for him on a bench, defying the town's scorn. Her gifts met only with a nod, until a funeral unveiled a stunning truth. Walter, once invisible, appeared in a pressed suit, his past as a wronged choir director shocking the congregation. What secret drove him to vanish after her compassion touched him? How did Talia's heart spark a revelation that shook the town? This story of grace and redemption will leave you breathless. Subscribe to our channel for the latest moving tales, and share in the comments where you're watching from. Will Walter's return rewrite their bond? Stay tuned. You won't believe how one woman's kindness transformed a forgotten man's life. Before the first light dared to touch the rooftops of Fairhaven, the town held its breath in the hush of dawn. The air was crisp, heavy with the scent of dew-soaked grass and the faint promise of autumn. Narrow streets, worn smooth by decades of routine, wound through a cluster of faded brick buildings and low-hanging maples, their leaves just beginning to blush red. In this small, sleepy town, where time moved like molasses and gossip was the currency of connection, nothing stirred unless you knew where to look. And Talia Monroe always knew. At exactly 4:45 a.m., when the world was still cloaked in a soft, inky blue, Talia stepped out from the back door of her modest apartment above the town's library. 27, with skin the color of rich mahogany and eyes that held a quiet fire, she moved with the grace of someone who had learned to tread lightly in a world quick to judge. Her breath puffed in small clouds as she pulled her woolen coat tighter, a plain brown paper bag tucked under her arm. The bag was unremarkable, creased at the edges, handles slightly frayed, but its contents were a ritual, a silent vow she'd kept for nearly a year. Inside was a sandwich, turkey and cheddar today, wrapped in wax paper, an apple polished to a shine, a bottle of water still cold from the fridge, and a folded napkin with 4 words scrawled in her careful hand. "You are not invisible." The path she took was one most in Fairhaven avoided, a narrow, uneven trail of cracked stone that curled behind the old chapel at the edge of town. The Fairhaven chapel, with its weathered steeple and ivy-choked walls, was a relic of better days, its stained glass windows dulled by time, but still catching the first rays of sunrise like a fading prayer. Behind it, hidden from the polished pews and the Sunday hymns, was a forgotten corner of the world. A small courtyard framed by a crumbling brick wall and a single stone bench, its surface smoothed by years of wind and neglect. And there, every morning, sat Walter Dempsey. He was a man carved from silence, his presence as constant as the chapel itself. In his late 60s or perhaps older, his skin was pale and creased like old parchment, his white hair thinning but neatly combed. His clothes, a threadbare jacket with frayed cuffs, trousers patched at the knees, were clean, meticulously so, as if he poured what little pride he had left into their care. A faded scarf, gray and heavy, hung loosely around his neck, and at his feet rested a battered canvas bag, its straps knotted from years of use. His boots, scuffed to the point of ruin, were always laced tight, as if ready for a journey he never took. Walter never spoke, never begged, never reached out. He simply sat, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the bricks, as if the world had long ago stopped seeing him, and he had agreed to its terms. Talia approached slowly, her footsteps soft against the stone, careful not to disturb the stillness that seemed to belong to him alone. The air was sharp, carrying the faint hum of crickets and the distant clatter of a milk truck on Main Street. She stopped a few feet from the bench, close enough to be seen but far enough to respect the invisible boundary he'd drawn. The bag crinkled faintly as she set it down beside him, its weight settling into the mossy grooves of the stone. Their eyes met for a fleeting moment, a glance so brief it might have been missed by anyone else. His were gray, clouded like a winter sky, but there was something alive in them, something that flickered and held her gaze just long enough to say, "I see you too." Then she turned, her coat brushing the air, and walked back the way she came. The chapel loomed behind her, its shadow stretching long and dark across the path. Talia had grown up in Fairhaven, a town where smiles were polite but eyes were sharp, where kindness was often a performance and secrets were buried under layers of propriety. She knew the whispers that followed her, had heard them since she was a girl, the only black child in a school of pale faces, the one who read too much, spoke too little, and carried herself with a quiet that some mistook for arrogance. But Talia wasn't arrogant. She was deliberate. Every choice she made, from the books she shelved in the chapel's tiny library to the bag she left each morning, was a thread in a tapestry she wove alone. Back in her apartment, she lit a single lamp and began her morning routine. The library wouldn't open for hours, but Talia was the keeper of its quiet spaces, a role she'd taken on after college when the world beyond Fairhaven felt too loud, too uncertain. She boiled water for tea, the kettle's hum filling the small room, and sat at a scarred wooden table to write the day's note. "You are not invisible." The words came easily now, as natural as breathing, but they hadn't always. The first time she'd written them, months ago, her hand had trembled, unsure if they were too bold, too presumptuous. She'd seen Walter on that bench one cold morning, his hands folded like a prayer, and something in her had stirred, a pull she couldn't name but couldn't ignore. So she'd started, with a single sandwich and no expectation, and now it was as much a part of her as the chapel's bells. The town didn't understand. She'd overheard the murmurs at the market, caught the sidelong glances from the choir members who lingered after practice. "Why does she bother?" they'd say, their voices low but sharp. "That old man's a ghost, probably dangerous." Talia let the words slide off her, though they left a faint sting like salt on a cut. She wasn't naive. She knew Walter could be anyone, a drifter, a man broken by loss, or something darker the town liked to imagine. But she also knew what it was to be unseen, to walk through a place where your presence was tolerated, but never truly welcomed. In Walter's silence, she saw a mirror, and in that mirror, she found purpose. As the sky began to lighten, painting the horizon in streaks of gold and gray, Talia pulled on her gloves and stepped back into the cold. The chapel was still, its doors locked until the first service. She paused at the edge of the courtyard, her breath catching as she glanced at the bench. The bag was gone. Walter sat as he always did, his hands resting on his knees, the scarf pulled tighter against the morning chill. He didn't look at her, but the faintest nod of his head told her everything. The ritual was complete for now. Tomorrow, she would return. In Fairhaven, where every day unfolded like the one before, Talia Monroe carried a secret no one else could see. Not in the bag, not in the words she wrote, but in the act itself, a defiance of the town's indifference, a quiet rebellion against a world that forgot too easily. And as she walked away, the chapel's shadow at her back, she felt the weight of it, heavy and warm, like a flame she'd sworn to keep burning. The dawn had barely broken over Fairhaven, its soft light filtering through the chapel's stained glass windows, casting fractured colors on the worn wooden pews. The air inside the old building was thick with the scent of polished oak and hymnals, a familiar comfort to the townsfolk who gathered for early choir practice. But outside, in the shadowed courtyard behind the chapel, the world was colder, sharper, and Talia Monroe felt it in every step she took. The brown paper bag crinkled faintly under her arm as she slipped through the narrow stone path, her boots silent against the frost-kissed ground. She had learned to move like a ghost, unseen and unheard, because Fairhaven had eyes that never slept and tongues that never stilled. Talia, at 27, was no stranger to scrutiny. Her dark skin, her quiet demeanor, her habit of keeping her thoughts tucked away like books on a high shelf. These had always set her apart in a town where conformity was a kind of currency. As the chapel's librarian, she spent her days among dusty tomes and faded records, her presence a quiet necessity rather than a celebrated one. But her mornings, those sacred moments before the world woke, belonged to Walter Dempsey, the white man who sat on the stone bench behind the chapel, silent as the ivy that clung to its walls. For nearly a year, she had left him a sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, and a note. "You are not invisible." And for nearly a year, the town had watched her do it with a mixture of pity and disdain. Inside the chapel, the choir's voices rose in tentative harmony, practicing for Sunday's service. Talia paused at the back door, her hand on the cold iron handle, listening to the muffled notes of Amazing Grace drift through the wood. She could picture them, Mrs. Harrow with her tightly pinned bun and pursed lips, young Eliza, who sang like an angel but gossiped like a storm, and Mr. Grayson, the deacon, whose deep baritone carried a weight of authority. They were the heart of Fairhaven's congregation, the keepers of its moral pulse, and they had opinions about everything, especially Talia. "She's at it again," Eliza's voice cut through the hymn's lull, sharp and bright as a blade. Talia froze, the bag still tucked under her arm, her breath catching in her throat. Every morning, like clockwork, wasting good food on that old man. The words were spoken in the hushed tone of someone who wanted to be overheard, and they were followed by a soft chuckle from another singer, a new girl whose name Talia hadn't learned. "Does he even eat it?" the girl asked, her voice tinged with curiosity and mockery. "Probably sells it for liquor," Mr. Grayson muttered, his tone heavy with the weight of judgment. The choir laughed, a low, rippling sound that felt like a slap. Talia's fingers tightened around the bag, the wax paper inside crinkling faintly. She wanted to push through the door, to stand before them and say something, anything, that would silence their careless cruelty. But she didn't. She never did. Instead, she turned and slipped back into the courtyard, her heart pounding against the cage of her ribs. The stone path felt colder now, the air heavier, as if the town's whispers had settled into the cracks of the earth. She reached the bench where Walter sat, his white hair catching the first glimmers of dawn, his hands folded in his lap like a man waiting for a train that would never come. His gray eyes flicked up to meet hers, just for a moment, and she placed the bag beside him, careful not to let her fingers brush the stone. He nodded, slow and deliberate, and she turned away, the weight of the choir's words trailing her like a shadow. Back in the library, a small room tucked beneath the chapel's eaves, Talia busied herself with sorting hymnals and cataloging donations. The space was her sanctuary, its shelves lined with leather-bound books and yellowed records, its air thick with the scent of aged paper. But even here, the whispers found her. Mrs. Harrow stopped by mid-morning, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, her smile as thin as a communion wafer. "Talia, dear," she said, her voice syrupy with concern, "I heard you were out back again. With that man." She paused, folding her hands as if in prayer. "It's not safe, you know. People talk, they worry." Talia kept her eyes on the ledger before her, her pen moving steadily across the page. "He's no trouble," she said, softly, her voice as calm as the surface of a still lake. Mrs. Harrow sighed, the sound heavy with pity. "It's not just about trouble, dear. It's about appearances. The chapel has a reputation to uphold. We don't want to encourage vagrancy." The word hung in the air, sharp and deliberate, a polite way to dismiss a man's existence. Talia nodded, not because she agreed, but because she knew silence was the only language Mrs. Harrow understood. The day wore on, and the whispers grew louder, more brazen. At the market where Talia stopped to buy apples, the cashier, a girl barely out of high school, leaned close and whispered, "Saw you behind the chapel this morning. You're braver than me, feeding that old ghost." At the post office, an elderly man muttered under his breath, "She's got no sense, throwing away good food." Even the children, playing hopscotch on the sidewalk, giggled and pointed as she passed, their voices high and cruel. "Talia's got a pet hobo." Each word was a pebble, small but heavy, piling up until they threatened to crush her resolve. But Talia was not fragile. She was steel wrapped in quiet, forged by years of standing apart in a town that never quite knew what to make of her. She thought of Walter, of the way his hands trembled slightly when he reached for the bag, of the careful way he tucked the napkin into his pocket, as if it were more precious than the food. She didn't know his story, didn't need to. She knew only that he was there every morning, a constant in a world that shifted too easily. And she knew that her act, small as it was a rebellion against Fairhaven's indifference, a dour refusal to let a man vanish into the cracks of its history. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the chapel's steeple cast a long shadow across the courtyard, Talia lingered at the library window, watching the bench where Walter sat. He was still there, his silhouette a quiet defiance against the fading light. She thought of the whispers, the judging eyes, the way they reduced him to a cautionary tale, a shadow to be swept away. And she thought of her note. Those 4 words. She wrote each morning, "You are not invisible." They were for Walter, but they were also for her, a reminder that in a town that saw only what it wanted, she would keep looking, keep seeing, keep leaving a bag on a bench until the world learned to do the same. The March morning broke over Fairhaven, with a gray, unyielding chill, the kind that seeped into bones and lingered like an uninvited guest. The chapel stood silent, its steeple shrouded in a mist that clung to the town like a half-forgotten dream. Talia Monroe moved through the pre-dawn hush, her breath visible in the cold, her boots whispering against the damp stone path behind the chapel. The brown paper bag in her hands, sandwich, apple, water, and a note, was a familiar weight, but today it felt different, as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for something to shift. At 27, Talia had grown used to the rhythm of her mornings, to the quiet ritual of leaving food for Walter Dempsey, the white man who sat on the moss-covered bench like a shadow the world had chosen to ignore. But this morning, something was about to change. The courtyard was a world apart from Fairhaven's polished streets, a hidden pocket where time seemed to pause. The ivy on the chapel's back wall glistened with dew, and the air carried the faint scent of wet earth and pine. Walter was there, as always, his white hair catching the dim glow of a distant street lamp, his weathered jacket pulled tight against the cold. His hands rested on his knees, still and deliberate, his gray eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the horizon. Talia approached with her usual care, her steps soft, her presence a quiet offering. She set the bag on the bench, just out of reach, respecting the unspoken boundary between them. Their eyes met, brief, electric, a silent thread that had grown stronger with each passing day. She turned to leave, the rustle of her coat the only sound in the stillness. But as she stepped away, something caught her eye. A faint flutter of white beneath the bench, nearly lost in the shadow of the stone. At first she thought it was a leaf, blown there by the wind, but her heart quickened as she bent down. It was a napkin, folded with a precision that felt almost sacred, its edges slightly damp from the morning mist. Her breath caught as she recognized her own handwriting peeking through the folds. "You are not invisible." This was one of her notes, one she'd left days ago, now returned to her like a message from another world. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, the paper soft and worn, revealing 4 words in a shaky, uneven script. "Thank you for seeing me." Talia stood frozen, the napkin cradled in her hands, the world around her fading into a blur. The words were simple, but they hit her like a thunderclap reverberating through her chest. Walter had never spoken, never acknowledged her beyond a nod, and yet here was his voice scrawled in ink that seemed to bleed with meaning. She read the words again, her eyes tracing each letter, as if they might vanish if she looked away. Her throat tightened, and for a moment she thought she might cry, not from sadness but from the weight of being seen in return. She glanced back at Walter, but he hadn't moved, his gaze still fixed on that distant point, as if the act of writing had cost him nothing and everything. Talia slipped the napkin into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against it as if it were a talisman. The courtyard felt different now. the air charged with a quiet electricity, as if the space itself had witnessed their exchange and held it close. She walked back to the chapel, her steps slower, her mind racing. The note was more than words. It was a crack in the wall of silence that had defined their ritual, a glimpse into the man Fairhaven had erased. She didn't know his story, didn't know why he sat there day after day, but those 4 words told her he was more than the town's, whispers more than a shadow on a bench. Inside the chapel's library, Talia tried to lose herself in her work, sorting hymnals and dusting shelves, but her hands betrayed her. They trembled as she stacked books, her fingers brushing the pocket where the napkin rested. The library was her refuge, a small room filled with the scent of old paper and the faint echo of Sunday hymns. But today it felt too small to contain the weight of what she carried. She pulled the napkin out, unfolding it carefully on her desk, and stared at the words again. "Thank you for seeing me." The script was unsteady, as if Walter hadn't held a pen in years, but it was deliberate. Each letter a choice, each word a confession. The morning passed in a haze. Outside, Fairhaven came to life, its streets buzzing with the usual rhythm of gossip and routine. Talia overheard snippets as she worked. A delivery boy joking Vitali mentioning the strange woman behind the chapel, a neighbor speculating about that old man's past. The whispers were familiar, their sting dulled by repetition, but today they barely registered. Her mind was with the napkin, with Walter, with the truth he'd entrusted to her. She thought of his hands, rough and careful, folding the paper with a precision that spoke of a life once lived with purpose. Who was he? The question burned in her, but she pushed it aside. It wasn't her place to ask. Not yet. By noon, the choir had gathered for practice, their voices drifting through the library walls. Talia braced herself for the inevitable murmurs. Eliza's sharp laugh cut through the air as she leaned toward a friend. "Talia's still playing saint, I see, feeding that ghost out back." Mr. Grayson's low grunt followed. "Foolish. Girl, he's probably trouble." Talia's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes on her work, her fingers brushing the napkin in her pocket. Their words were noise, meaningless against the quiet truth she now held. She didn't need their approval. She had Walter's words, and they were enough. As evening fell, Talia stood at the library window, watching the courtyard where Walter sat. The sky was a bruise of purple and gold, and he was still there, a silhouette against the fading light. She thought of the napkin, of the trembling hand that had written those words, and felt a fire kindling in her chest. Not anger, but purpose. Fairhaven could whisper all it wanted. Talia Monroe had seen a man the world forgot, and now he had seen her back. The napkin, tucked safely in her pocket, was a promise, a thread that bound them in silence, and she would carry it until the day it led her to his truth. The air in Fairhaven carried a bite as winter's edge sharpened, the kind of cold that made the chapel's stained glass windows gleam like frozen jewels. Talia Monroe moved through the early morning, her breath clouding in the dim light, her boots tracing the familiar stone path behind the chapel. The brown paper bag in her hands, sandwich, apple, water, and a note reading "You are not invisible," was a quiet rebellion, a ritual now 9 months strong. At 27, with her dark eyes burning with unspoken resolve, Talia had become a fixture in this hidden courtyard, as constant as the man she came to see. Walter Dempsey sat on the mossy bench, his white hair catching the faint glow of dawn, his weathered jacket a shield against the world's indifference. But today, the weight of Fairhaven's judgment pressed harder, and Talia felt it like a storm gathering on the horizon. The courtyard was still, save for the rustle of ivy and the breeze and the distant hum of the town waking. Walter's gray eyes met hers as she placed the bag beside him, their silent exchange a thread woven through months of mornings. She turned away, her coat brushing the air, the napkin from days ago, "Thank you for seeing me," burning a hole in her pocket. Its words had changed something in her, a spark that made the whispers of Fairhaven sting sharper. She had always known the town watched her, judged her, But now their voices felt like chains, pulling at the edges of her conviction. Back in the chapel's library, Talia tried to lose herself in the familiar tasks, sorting hymnals, dusting, shelves, cataloging donations. The room was a sanctuary, its air heavy with the scent of old paper and wax, but it couldn't shield her from the growing pressure. The choir's rehearsal drifted through the walls, their voices rising in "Nearer, my God, to thee," but the harmony was undercut by whispers. Eliza, the young soprano with a tongue as sharp as her notes, leaned toward a friend. "Talia's still out there feeding that old man. Doesn't she ever get tired?" The words were soft but deliberate, meant to carry. Mr. Grayson, the deacon, grunted in response. "She's asking for trouble. That kind never changes." Talia's hand paused over a stack of books, her fingers tightening until her knuckles paled. She wanted to shout to make them see Walter as she did, a man, not a problem, but her voice stayed locked in her throat, as it always did. The library door creaked open, and Talia's mother, Evelyn, stepped inside, her heels clicking with purpose. Evelyn Monroe was a woman of poise, her hair swept into a neat bun, her eyes sharp with the kind of concern that masked control. She carried a thermos of tea, a pretext for the visit, but Talia knew better. "I saw you this morning," Evelyn said, setting the thermos on the desk with a deliberate thud. "Out back with that man again." Her voice was low, laced with warning. "Talia, you're risking everything. Your job, your reputation. People are talking and not kindly." Talia kept her eyes on the ledger before her, her pen scratching numbers she barely saw. "He's not hurting anyone," she said softly, her voice steady but tight. Evelyn sighed, the sound heavy with exasperation. "It's not about him hurting anyone. It's about you. You're the chapel's librarian, not a charity worker. You could lose your place here. And for what? A man who doesn't even speak." Talia's jaw clenched, her fingers brushing the napkin in her pocket. She wanted to show it to her mother, to hold up those shaky words, "Thank you for seeing me," and make her understand. But Evelyn wouldn't see. She never had. The conversation hung in the air, unresolved, as Evelyn left with a final warning glance. Talia sat alone, the library's silence pressing against her. She thought of Walter, of the way his hands folded the scarf she'd left him, of the nod that spoke louder than words. She had memorized his rhythms, the slow rise of his chest, the careful way he tucked her notes into his pocket. To her, it wasn't charity. It was something deeper, something she called mourning. Not for Walter, but for the world that had let him fade. To Fairhaven, it was defiance, a challenge to their carefully curated order. Later that day, the chapel's librarian manager, Mr. Whitlock, called Talia into his office. He was a kind man, or at least he played the part, with gray hair and a voice that softened his warnings. "Talia," he began, folding his hands on the desk, "we all admire your heart, truly, but some of the congregation have expressed concerns about the man behind the chapel. It's not good for the church's image to have him lingering there." His eyes were gentle, but his words were a blade, cloaked in civility. "Perhaps it's best if you keep your kindness private, for everyone's sake." Talia nodded, her face a mask of calm, but inside her heart roared. She saw their logic. Fairhaven thrived on appearances, on the illusion of perfection. Walter, with his tattered jacket and silent presence, was a crack in that facade. But to Talia, he was more than a problem to be solved. He was a man who carried a story in his silence, a dignity in his stillness. She thought of the napkin, of the words that had shaken her world. She wouldn't stop, not now, not ever. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and ash, Talia stood at the library window, watching the courtyard. Walter was still there, a shadow against the fading light, his scarf a faint flag of resilience, the town's whispers, Eliza's mockery, her mother's warnings, Mr. Whitlock's counsel, swirled around her, but they couldn't touch the truth she held. She had seen Walter when no one else would. And he had seen her back. The napkin in her pocket was proof, a quiet vow that she would keep bringing the bag, keep writing the notes, keep defying a town that chose to forget. As the chapel's bells tolled softly, Talia felt the fire in her chest burn brighter. Not anger, but conviction, a flame that would carry her through the storm of Fairhaven's judgment. The Fairhaven chapel stood bathed in the soft, mournful light of an autumn afternoon, its steeple cutting a somber silhouette against a sky heavy with clouds. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and candle wax, the pews filled with townsfolk dressed in black, their faces etched with the polite grief expected of such occasions. The sudden death of Father Latham, the chapel's beloved pastor, had shaken Fairhaven, drawing its people together in a rare moment of unity. But for Talia Monroe, the day carried a different weight. At 27, she moved through the chapel's side rooms with quiet purpose, her dark eyes steady, her hands arranging a small memorial table with photographs and flowers. The brown paper bag she left each morning for Walter Dempsey, the white man on the bench behind the chapel, felt distant now, yet its echo lingered in her heart, a reminder of the unseen bonds she carried. Talia had spent the morning preparing the memorial space, a modest alcove off the main sanctuary where Father Latham's life was to be honored. She placed a framed photo of him smiling, his hands clasped in prayer, and arranged white lilies around a guest book for condolences. The task was a distraction, a way to keep her hands busy while the town's whispers about her, about Walter, swirled in her mind. For 9 months she had left food and notes for the silent man, enduring Fairhaven's judgment. The napkin he'd returned, "Thank you for seeing me," still rested in her pocket, a quiet talisman against the town's disdain. But today her focus was on duty, on honoring a man who had always greeted her with kindness, even if he never fully understood her morning ritual. As the organ began its slow, mournful prelude, the congregation settled into the pews, their murmurs softening into reverence. Talia stood at the edge of the sanctuary, her black dress simple but elegant, her hair pulled back in a neat braid. The choir, led by Mrs. Harrow, began a hymn, their voices trembling with emotion. Talia's eyes drifted to the windows where the light fell in fractured colors, and she thought of Walter, of the bench outside, empty now in the midday hush. She hadn't seen him this morning. Her duties had kept her inside, but she'd left the bag as always, trusting he'd find it. The hymn reached its crescendo, and the chapel doors swung open with a creak that silenced the room. Heads turned, and a collective gasp rippled through the pews. Talia froze, her heart lurching as she saw him. Walter Dempsey stepping into the sanctuary with a presence that seemed to shift the air itself. He wore a black suit, old but meticulously pressed, its lapels sharp against his pale, weathered skin. The scarf she'd given him months ago, gray and frayed, was folded neatly over his shoulder, a quiet nod to their bond. Behind him walked 3 elderly figures in faded choir robes, their faces lined with age and recognition, and 2 men, in dark suits, their postures stiff with purpose like sentinels. The congregation stared, their whispers swallowed by shock. Walter moved forward, his steps steady, his gray eyes fixed on the memorial table at the front. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft thud of his boots on the wooden floor, each step a drumbeat in the stillness. Talia's breath caught as she watched him, her hands clasped tightly to keep them from trembling. She had never seen him anywhere but the bench, never imagined him in this space, among the polished pews and judgmental eyes. Yet here he was, not as the ghost Fairhaven mocked, but as a man with a purpose that commanded the room. He reached the memorial table and paused, his hand steady as he placed the scarf beside Father Latham's photograph, a gesture so deliberate it felt like a prayer. He turned to the officiating priest, a young man who looked as stunned as the congregation, and gave a slow, respectful nod. Then turning to face the pews, Walter stood tall, his shoulders squared, his presence a quiet rebuke to the town's indifference. The silence stretched, taut and fragile, until a woman in the choir, a middle-aged soprano with tear-streaked cheeks, stood and spoke, her voice breaking. "He taught me to sing," she said, her words echoing in the vastness of the chapel. "That's Walter Dempsey." The name hung in the air, a spark igniting recognition in the older faces. Whispers stirred, not of scorn now, but of memory. "The choir director," someone murmured, "from years ago." "Before the scandal." Talia's heart pounded as she watched the shift, the way the congregation's eyes widened, their judgment unraveling. Mrs. Harrow, usually so composed, clutched her hymn book, her face pale. Mr. Grayson, the deacon, stared at Walter as if seeing a ghost made flesh. And then, from the back, a single clap broke the silence, tentative at first, then joined by another and another, until the chapel filled with applause, not loud, but deep, like a tide rolling in. Talia stood rooted, her eyes locked on Walter. He didn't acknowledge the applause, didn't bow or smile. He simply stood, his gaze steady, his silence louder than the clapping hands. She saw it then, the dignity she'd always sensed, now visible to a room that had once turned away. The three figures in choir robes stepped forward, their faces etched with pride, and Talia realized they were his former students, come to honor a man they'd never forgotten. The men in suits, bodyguards perhaps, stood watch, their presence, a mystery that deepened the moment's weight. The priest cleared his throat, signaling the congregation to settle, but the air had changed. The hymn resumed, softer now, as if the choir feared breaking the spell. Talia moved to the side, her hands trembling with a mix of awe and vindication. She touched the napkin in her pocket, its words, "Thank you for seeing me," a quiet echo of this moment. Walter had come not for her, not for the town, but for Father Latham, for a past he'd carried in silence. And in doing so, he had shattered Fairhaven's illusion, forcing them to see what they'd refused for so long. As the service continued, Talia's eyes stayed on Walter, now seated in a back pew, his hands folded, his scarf resting beside him. The congregation stole glances, their faces a mix of shame and wonder. Talia felt a fire kindling in her chest, not triumph, but clarity. She had given Walter food, notes, a scarf, but today he had given her something greater, proof that her kindness had mattered, that it had reached a man the world had tried to erase. The chapel's bells tolled as the service ended, and Talia knew, as she watched Walter rise and slip quietly out, that this moment was only the beginning of a truth yet to unfold. The Fairhaven chapel stood hushed in the wake of Father Latham's funeral, its walls still echoing with the applause that had greeted Walter Dempsey's unexpected entrance. The autumn dusk settled over the town, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and amber, as if the world itself were pausing to catch its breath. Talia Monroe lingered in the chapel's library, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of what she had witnessed. At 27, her dark eyes burned with a fire that had grown fiercer since Walter stepped into the sanctuary, his presence shattering the town's carefully curated indifference. The napkin in her pocket, "Thank you for seeing me," felt heavier now, a silent testament to a truth she sensed was only beginning to surface. Tonight she would dig deeper, driven by a conviction that refused to rest. The library was a shadowed refuge, its shelves lined with dusty hymnals and records that smelled of aged paper and secrets. Talia had always found solace here, among the forgotten tomes and faded ink. But now it felt like a battlefield, each document a potential weapon in a fight she hadn't chosen, but couldn't ignore. Walter's appearance at the funeral, his pressed suit, the scarf she'd given him, the choir members who called him teacher, had stirred something in her. A need to know who he was, why Fairhaven had erased him. The whispers of a scandal lingered in her mind, vague but sharp, like a blade hidden in fog. She locked the library door, the click echoing in the stillness, and turned to the archive cabinet, its drawers heavy with the weight of the past. The cabinet was a relic. Its wood warped and hinges rusted, but it held the chapel's history. Baptism records, choir rosters, letters of praise and complaint. Talia's fingers moved with purpose, flipping through yellowed folders, her breath shallow as she searched for Walter's name. The light from a single lamp cast long shadows, dancing across the walls as she pulled out a file labeled Personnel, 1989-2002. Her heart quickened as she opened it, the pages brittle under her touch. There, in faded ink, was his name. Walter Dempsey, choir director. The words were stark, official, but they carried a weight that made her pause. She sank into a chair, the file open on her lap, and began to read. The records painted a picture of a man beloved and revered. Letters from parishioners praised Walter's ability to coax harmony from even the most reluctant voices, his patience with children, his gift for turning hymns into moments of transcendence. A 1995 note from a young soprano, perhaps the woman who had wept at the funeral, called him a guiding light. But as Talia turned the pages, the tone shifted. A 2002 memo, written in the sharp, impersonal hand of a church elder, mentioned concerns about Walter's conduct. Another, dated weeks later, recommended his dismissal, citing unsubstantiated allegations and disruptive behavior. The final page was a single letter, unsigned, accusing Walter of challenging a pastor's authority, of stirring unrest by questioning financial decisions. The word scandal was scrawled in the margin, its ink darker, as if pressed with anger. Talia's breath caught, her fingers trembling as she traced the words. This was no scandal. It was a burial. Walter had been cast out, his name smeared, his contributions erased, all because he dared to speak a truth the chapel didn't want to hear. She closed the file, her heart pounding with a fire that wasn't anger but something fiercer, resolve. Fairhaven had hidden this man, reduced him to a shadow on a bench, but Talia would not let their lies stand unchallenged. She pulled out a small stack of blank paper, her hand steady now, and began copying the documents by hand, each stroke of her pen a quiet act of defiance. The night deepened, the chapel's silence broken only by the faint creak of the building. Settling, Talia worked until her eyes burned, the lamplight flickering as if in solidarity. When she finished, she gathered the copies and slipped them into an envelope, her movements deliberate, her mind racing. She knew what she had to do. The chapel's hallway, lined with notices for bake sales and prayer groups, had a bulletin, board near the entrance, a place where the congregation's eyes lingered. She moved through the darkened corridors, her steps soft but sure, and pinned the documents to the board, each page a silent shout. The letters of praise, the accusations, the dismissal, they would be seen, not by the choir or the elders, but by the town itself, by the people who had whispered and judged. As she stepped back, the board now a patchwork of truth, Talia felt a tremor in her chest. Not fear, but clarity. She thought of Walter, of the way he'd stood in the sanctuary, his scarf a badge of their bond, his silence louder than the applause. She didn't know the full story of his fall, didn't know the pastor he'd challenged or the price he'd paid, but she knew he had been wronged. And she knew that her mornings, her bags of food, her notes, had been more than kindness. They had been a refusal to let him vanish completely. Outside, the courtyard was cloaked in darkness. The bench, empty under the faint glow of a street lamp. Talia stood at the chapel's back door, the envelope still in her hand, its weight a reminder of the truth she'd uncovered. She thought of the napkin, of Walter's shaky words, "Thank you for seeing me," and felt a fire kindling in her soul. Fairhaven had buried Walter Dempsey, but Talia had found him, not just on the bench, but in the pages of a forgotten file. She slipped the envelope into her coat next to the napkin and stepped into the night, the cold air sharp against her skin. The town slept, its streets quiet, but Talia felt the world shifting beneath her feet. The documents on the bulletin board would be seen by morning, when the congregation gathered for coffee and prayer. There would be whispers, perhaps outrage, but also questions that might force Fairhaven to confront what it had done. Talia didn't expect redemption, not yet, but she had planted a seed, one that might grow in the cracks of the town's indifference. As she walked home, the chapel's shadow at her back, She thought of Walter's nod, of the scarf he wore, of the man who had once led a choir and now sat in silence. She had seen him, and now she would make sure others did too. The dawn over Fair Haven was heavy with frost, the kind that etched delicate patterns on the chapel's stained glass windows and turned the stone path behind it into a slick, shimmering ribbon. Talia Monroe stepped into the November chill, her breath a fleeting cloud, the familiar brown paper bag, sandwich, apple, water, and a note, clutched tightly against her coat. At 27, her dark eyes held a quiet fire, tempered by the weight of the truth she'd uncovered in the chapel's archives. Walter Dempsey, the white man who sat on the mossy bench, was no longer just a silent figure. He was a choir director wronged, a man buried by Fair Haven's secrets. The napkin in her pocket, "Thank you for seeing me," was a tether to him. But this morning, as she approached the courtyard, her heart sank. The bench was empty. Talia stopped, her boots rooted to the stone, the cold seeping through her soles. The courtyard felt wrong, its silence too vast, too final. The ivy clung to the chapel's wall, glistening with frost, but the bench, Walter's bench, was bare, save for a single gray scarf, folded with a care that was unmistakably his. It lay like a relic, its frayed edges catching the faint dawn light. Beside it, tucked into a crevice of the stone, was an empty paper bag, one of hers, its wax paper smoothed flat as if he'd preserved it. Talia's breath hitched, her fingers trembling as she reached for the scarf. It was soft, worn. The same one she'd given him months ago now returned like a farewell. She searched the courtyard, her eyes darting to the shadows, the alley, the distant trees, but Walter was gone. The air grew heavier, pressing against her chest as she knelt beside the bench, the scarf in her hands. She felt a pang, sharp and unfamiliar, not just loss, but a fear that she had missed something, that her mornings of quiet offerings had not been enough. The napkin's words echoed in her mind, a promise she'd held close since that gray March morning. Had he left because of the funeral, because of the applause that had broken his silence? Or had Fair Haven's judgment finally driven him away? She clutched the scarf, its faint scent of earth and time grounding her, and slipped it into her coat next to the napkin. She wouldn't let him vanish, not completely. Back in the chapel's library, Talia moved through her tasks like a ghost, her hands sorting hymnals while her mind wandered the empty bench. The room, with its shelves of dusty records and the faint hum of the heater, felt smaller today, as if it couldn't contain the weight of Walter's absence. She pulled the napkin from her pocket, unfolding it on her desk, its shaky script a lifeline to a man she'd never truly known. "Thank you for seeing me." The words were a wound now, a reminder of what she might have lost. She thought of the documents she'd pinned to the chapel's bulletin board, the letters of praise, the accusations, the dismissal that had stripped Walter of his place. Had they driven him away, exposing a truth he wasn't ready to face? The town buzzed with its usual rhythm, but the whispers had changed. At the market, the cashier mentioned Walter's appearance at the funeral, her voice tinged with awe rather than scorn. "He looked like someone important," she said, almost to herself. At the post office, an elderly woman asked Talia, "Is it true he was the choir director?" The questions were tentative, laced with shame, as if Fair Haven was waking to its own guilt. But Talia had no answers, only the scarf and the empty bench. She nodded, her face a mask of calm, and moved on, her heart racing with a need to do something, anything, to keep Walter's presence alive. That evening, as the chapel's shadow stretched long across the courtyard, Talia returned to the library, her steps purposeful. She unlocked a storage closet, its door creaking with neglect, and pulled out a faded blueprint tucked among old hymnals. It was a plan for the chapel's basement, a forgotten space beneath the bell tower, once meant for storage, but abandoned, to dust and cobwebs. She spread the blueprint on her desk, her fingers tracing the lines of a small room with a single window. An idea took root, fragile but fierce, a space where silence could be shared, where no one had to earn their place. She saw it clearly, 2 chairs, a table, a kettle for tea. a refuge for those the world overlooked, just as she had seen Walter. Talia worked late into the night, the library lit by a single lamp. She swept the basement floor, its concrete cold under her hands, and scrubbed the walls until her arms ached. She dragged a small table from storage, its wood scarred but sturdy, and placed two mismatched chairs beside it. A kettle, borrowed from her apartment, sat on a crate, its cord coiled neatly. The space was simple, unadorned, but it felt right. A place where presence mattered more than words. She stood back, her breath uneven, and imagined Walter sitting there, his scarf around his neck, his silence no longer a burden but a gift. By morning, the basement room was ready, its single window catching the first light like a promise. Talia hung the napkin on the wall, its faded words framed in a simple wooden square she'd found in storage. Below it, she tacked a note in her own hand, for Walter Dempsey, whose silence speaks louder than words. She didn't know if he would return, didn't know if he was alive or lost to the world, but this space, her silent sanctuary, was her vow to keep seeing him, to keep, seeing everyone Fairhaven forgot. She placed the scarf on the table, its folds a quiet prayer, and stepped back into the dawn. The town stirred, unaware of the change taking root beneath the chapel. Talia walked the stone path to the bench, her hands empty for the first time. In months, the emptiness felt wrong, but the scarf in the basement, the napkin on the wall, held her steady. Walter had vanished, but he had left her something. A purpose, a fire that burned brighter than Fairhaven's judgment. As the chapel's bells tolled, soft and mournful, Talia felt the world shift just slightly toward something new. She didn't know where Walter was, but she knew he wasn't gone. Not as long as she kept the sanctuary waiting, its door open, its silence ready to welcome him home. Winter had tightened its grip on Fairhaven, dusting the chapel's steeple with a fine layer of snow that glittered like scattered stars in the early morning light. The town moved through its routines, its streets alive with the crunch of boots and the murmur of holiday preparations. But beneath the chapel's bell tower, a quieter revolution was taking shape. Talia Monroe, at 27, stood in the basement room she had transformed, her dark eyes reflecting the faint glow of a single bulb. The space was humble. 2 chairs, a scarred wooden table, a kettle humming softly on a crate. But to her, it was sacred. She called it the Silent Sanctuary, a haven for those the world overlooked, born from the absence of Walter Dempsey, the white man whose empty bench still haunted her mornings. The napkin, "Thank you for seeing me," hung framed on the wall, a beacon in the dimness, and Talia felt its weight as she prepared to open the door. The basement was cold, its concrete walls bare save for a small brass plaque she'd nailed beneath. The napkin, in memory of Walter Dempsey, whose silence speaks for a choir. The words were her vow, etched in metal, to honor the man who had vanished 2 days after Father Latham's funeral. She didn't know where he'd gone, only that his scarf, folded neatly on the table, and the empty paper bag he'd left behind were all that remained of their quiet bond. But Talia was no stranger to carrying forward in the face of loss. Her dark hands, steady despite the chill, arranged a tray of simple offerings: bread, cheese, a thermos of tea on the table. This was not a soup kitchen, not a charity. It was a space where no one had to speak, no one had to prove their worth, only sit and be seen. The first morning, as dawn broke in shades of silver and frost, Talia unlocked the basement door and stepped back, her breath catching in the cold air. She didn't expect anyone, not yet. The town was still reeling from the funeral, from the documents she'd pinned to the chapel's bulletin board exposing Walter's wrongful dismissal. Whispers had turned to questions, and Fairhaven's polished surface had begun to crack. But the sanctuary was her answer, not to the town's guilt, but to the silence Walter had left behind. She stood by the window, its single pane fogged with her breath, and waited, her heart a drumbeat of hope and fear. The first to come was an old man, his face lined like a map of forgotten roads, his coat patched but clean. He hesitated at the door, his eyes wary, as if expecting a trap. Talia nodded, her smile soft, and gestured to a chair. He sat, his hands trembling as he took a piece of bread and ate in silence, his gaze fixed on the napkin's words. No questions, no demands, just presence. By noon, a woman appeared, her hair gray and tangled, her eyes hollow with a story she didn't share. She sipped tea, her fingers wrapped around the mug, and left without a word. Talia watched them come and go, her chest tight with a feeling she couldn't name, a mix of grief for Walter and gratitude for these strangers who filled his absence. Word spread slowly, like ripples in a still pond. By the third day, a young boy with dirt-streaked knees slipped in, his eyes wide as he took an apple from the table. He sat cross-legged on the floor, crunching quietly, and Talia felt a pang, seeing Walter's stillness in the boy's small frame. The sanctuary became a rhythm, not unlike her mornings with the paper bag. People came, veterans with scars hidden under worn jackets, a retired school janitor who hummed hymns under his breath, an elderly woman who carried a tattered Bible but never opened it. They didn't speak, and Talia didn't ask. She served tea, refilled the bread, and let the silence do its work, a language deeper than words. The town noticed, of course. Fair Haven never slept through change. At the market, the cashier whispered to a customer, "Talia's got a place under the chapel now. For strays, I guess." At the post office, an elder shook his head, muttering, "She's turning the church into a shelter." But Talia heard none of it. She was too busy sweeping the sanctuary's floor, wiping the table, keeping the kettle full. The whispers couldn't touch her here, not when the room was alive with the quiet presence of those who came. Each visitor was a thread, weaving a tapestry Walter had begun, his absence now a catalyst for something greater. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Talia sat alone in the sanctuary, the bulb casting a warm glow over the napkin's frame. She touched the brass plaque, her fingers tracing Walter's name, and thought of the bench, empty now under a blanket of frost. She didn't know if he was alive, if he'd fled the town's gaze or simply faded into another shadow. But the sanctuary was her answer, a way to keep his presence alive, to say to every stranger who sat at her table, "You are not invisible." The scarf, still folded on the table, was a relic of their bond, and she left it there, a silent invitation for his return. The door creaked and Talia looked up, startled. A man stood in the doorway, his face weathered, his eyes carrying the weight of wars unspoken. He nodded, as Walter once had, and took a seat. Talia poured tea, her hands steady, her heart full. The sanctuary was small, unpolished, but it was enough. It was a place where silence was not a void, but a gift, where the forgotten could sit and be seen. As the man sipped his tea, Talia felt the fire in her chest burn brighter, not triumph, but purpose. Walter was gone, but his echo lived in this room, in the napkin on the wall, in the strangers who came. The chapel's bells tolled above, soft and distant, and Talia knew this was only the beginning, a sanctuary born from silence, ready to hold all who needed it. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey through Thank You for Seeing Me. Talia and Walter's story reminds us that a single act of kindness can ripple through silence, touching lives in ways we never imagine. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments what moved you most or how this story resonates with you. Your reflections mean the world to us. If this tale touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell for more stories that inspire. Until next time, keep seeing the unseen, and we'll meet again soon with another tale to share. Stay kind, and thank you for being here.